from the U of A,
Hi.
Obstetrics and Gynecology. You talk about regulation as being a particular problem in in Canada.
Yeah.
In what way is it worse in Canada than in, say, Europe or in the States?
Yeah, well, this may not be that broadly known, but Canada, and we have one regulator for safety and efficacy, which is Health Canada, and the medical devices branch. All I can say is from experience that we find that our products are approved in Canada almost last in the world. It's sort of a race between Canada and Japan, and often the US even is sooner, but Europe is certainly way sooner. Now, I don't think, I would not want to make an argument that our patients should be less safe and that the product should be less effective. So it's not about that. But the reality is, for an innovative startup company, it takes a long time for them to reach the market, because of the requirements that continue to grow. So it is a factor here, whereas you see in Europe, things happen much earlier, and even in the US. And so I think the question is, could we possibly assemble that information differently, more quickly? We're dealing with a product life cycle in devices that averages around 18 months to 2 years, and yet it can sometimes take 3 or 4 years to get through all the hurdles to get to market. So time is really an important element. And then even when you get approved by Health Canada, then you've got, assuming it's a new technology, there may not be any reimbursement for it, so then you really have to do the health technology assessment route, which again, that adds more lead time. So it ends up being 10 years before you get to market sometimes. So it's very challenging. Does that answer your question? Good. Yes?
From the borrow from National Research Council IRA program.
Yes.
Thank you. You're probably familiar with NRC IRA program being now on the advisory board of
Absolutely.
the life science portfolio.
Yeah.
So, being a president of a large Canadian medical technology company, what would be your approach to accessing new innovative technologies being developed by SME community, just to help perhaps some of the SME CEOs that we have in this room in terms of looking for connections, and you mentioned connection and access is a very big part of it. So what they can do to increase their chances to get the attention of your attention, or perhaps some assistance in some ways to get their technologies to the marketplace.
Okay. Well, there's quite a spectrum involved, and first of all, I'll talk about, I mentioned, each company has its core areas of business. And so if the innovative company is in a core area of business of certain multinationals, then there would be a very natural opportunity to discuss the opportunity to take that global with them. So I think forums like this, like Bio Alberta, and others that are across the country are a great opportunity for people to connect on that. So that's one. But if it's not in a core area of a company, they still may be interested, but it really needs to go through more of a venture phase where it attracts investment and starts to demonstrate efficacy and a market. Because large companies often will not go into a new field unless it's a major commitment, a platform type commitment. That's a much bigger hurdle for them to do. So I think you're best to work with companies that have something in common with you terms of the area of healthcare and medicine. So I don't know if that answers your question. But I mean, we work directly with doctors in areas that that we're very focused on. Sometimes it doesn't even go through a venture company. But we're constantly scanning and looking for venture phase companies that have interesting ideas that we could work with. So we're doing that all over the world.
So is there any kind of a common point, contact point for SMEs that you'd like to get some feedback from you?
Well, many of us have business development people in Canada, you know, who are excellent contacts because they know everybody in the corporation that's working on development, so it can be a great bridge in to specific business units. You know, I think many of my colleagues in the room would be happy to share who those people are at their company. I think that's probably the best. But I think also if you're working with leading doctors in a specific field, then often the doctors make the connection because they're working with different companies as well, and they can see where a specific technology might fit. Yes, other questions? Yeah. Hello?
Hi, Marnie Phaeton with Alberta Health Clinical Advisor and Research.
Yeah.
Just wondering if you could speak a bit about the comment regarding the Mars Excite
Yeah.
model of accelerated market access for innovative devices and whatnot in terms of the larger companies paying the freight costs.
Well, I think, you know, their model. Yeah, I'm happy to. I made sort of an offhand comment that the Mars Excite model really intends to have the larger companies, you know, I said pay the freight. The idea is, you know, we're sort of, when we do a project with them, we're all in. So the costs are very significant to us, but the idea is we're paying for the infrastructure so that they can work with startup companies at a lower rate. And I think that's totally fair. There's a business model for it, for us in it, and there's a business model for the startup companies. So it works very well.
Okay, thank you. I did understand that it is essentially a paid service, so to speak. Would that be fair?
I'm sorry?
Would it be fair to say that the Mars Excite model is a sort of paid service?
Yeah, it's sort of like a CRO, but it goes much further than that because it covers all of these bases, including knowledge translation, which I think that's one of the key things that is still yet to be demonstrated, is that they can, you know, once you've proven that an innovation is highly favored, can you translate that into utilization? Yes, this gentleman over here.
Hi, Gerald Cole from the University of Calgary. I was giving some thought to what you said about talent in Canada and one of the problems faced with companies starting up here in medical devices and the lack of talent. And it's certainly something that we've talked about within the university, and I also work with industry, but
Yeah.
it seems like a bit of a chicken and an egg scenario.
Yeah.
That without the industry sort of established R&D sort of industry, there aren't jobs for the engineering students coming in.
That's right. That's very frustrating to be an engineering graduate who wants to work in biomedical engineering, and you know there aren't many opportunities.
Does Medtronic have any R&D activities, the large companies R&D activities in Canada?
Yeah, well, I would answer that in two ways. You know, McKinsey did a study a couple of years ago looking at R&D, and more than 50% of R&D is directly associated with manufacturing facilities, because you've got the continuation engineering, the new product development, that sort of thing. So a lot of people have said in the past, how important is manufacturing? The answer is it's very important. So to the extent that we can attract and retain manufacturing in Canada, that will be very good for R&D. The second thing, though, is More on the research and the clinical research side, we do employ clinical engineers all over the world who work with investigators and researchers to develop products. That's more of a field clinical engineering kind of position. But I think for us in Canada, you know, our largest concentration of engineers is in Montreal because that's where our cryocath center is. And so I think that model, if we could attract more of those kinds of developments from the different companies in Canada, that would be very good for our graduates. Over here?
I was just, one question. You mentioned about the Canadian environment, about some things that were barriers to it, too. I was wondering if there were things that were I know you did mention a bunch of positive things about the Canadian environment. Is there anything around with Alberta in terms of the adjustments that have been made recently with we now have a single health authority? Are there things that, how is Alberta viewed by your company as a national company as a kind of an opportunity? And the second question I have is, I know that medical device companies used to have clinical leaders as a kind of a key customer that they tried to connect and understand. And whether or not, I've just heard from them that that's changing quite a bit. That sometimes you now have guideline developers and other kind of approaches. And so is your company having to change to deal with some different customers as to who you're
well, I think just first with the latter point, I think it's not an or, it's an and. So you know, we continue to work very closely with clinical leaders on clinical research and the development of new products. But the and is that that's no longer enough really to be successful, and particularly when we're talking about new categories that currently don't exist. You really need to develop the whole dossier of you know, health technology assessment, and also sometimes it can involve medical people that don't currently exist, like the specialty may not exist. Like you know, we recently had a technology developed in hypertension. There are very few people that are interventional hypertension people in the market. So it's a new development, really, and that takes time. Getting back to your earlier question, though, about Alberta, we have always felt that Alberta was a pool of talent in the medical research area, and also I think in engineering, although some of that's really more focused on other sectors, but it could certainly translate to our sector. So that really hasn't changed. So that's a real asset that you have. The fact that you have a single system, you know, and increasingly in research, we're focusing on this thing everyone calls big data. So if you had the ability to really assemble data on all of your citizens, and I know there's the Approach database for cardiovascular patients that grew out of Alberta. But these kinds of databases can be very, very informative on how to develop products. So in other words, if we could take your database and put in our product characteristics and look at what kind of outcomes that might generate, that would be very, very interesting. And so there are a lot more discussions going on like that. I know Ontario has the ISIS database you're probably very familiar with, and there are other ones around the world. But I think Canadians, and I think it's true, a lot of people move to Alberta. I'm not sure a lot of people move from Alberta. They tend to stay here. But that's good for database, you know, because you don't lose people to follow up. And so statistically, it's very strong. So I think that your single system and your ability perhaps to retain the data in Alberta could be a real asset for the future. Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.